He tapped the microphone twice. The sound punched through crystal chandeliers and the polite thunder of 100 conversations. It was the kind of small, performative motion Chinua used as punctuation. Half confidence, half command. He smiled like a man who had rehearsed his generosity for the cameras. Behind him the stage gleamed, a long table dressed in white, a banner with the firm's logo, an abstract lattice, hung low. Cameras angled in, black lenses like curious birds. At table 12, Muna sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, the thin gold bracelet on her wrist catching the chandelier light in a private, patient sparkle. A cream envelope lay at the corner of her placemat, almost invisible against the linen. She had left her phone face down. No one noticed. The room wanted the show. Chinua announced Renee as if unveiling a new product. He used the language of legacy, words about fresh leadership, the future of this house, someone who understands the brand. Renee rose in a gown that swallowed light, a wash of gold sequins that made the cameras hungry. Applause swelled. Gloria clapped the loudest, a practice sound that filled in any silence Chinua wanted to avoid. He reached for the placard, Muna's placard, and with a casual public flourish said, "Tonight we pass this seat to someone who will carry our vision forward." He held the paper like a trophy. Then, with the ineffable air of the man used to being the story, he slid it toward Renee. The room applauded again. Photographers leaned in. Headlines Chinua must have imagined would favor the theater: a founder, magnanimous, a mistress elevated, a wife gracefully sidelined. The cameras liked a neat narrative. They liked faces they could caption. Muna did not stand. She did not look surprised. She smiled once, faint and clean, as if greeting a minor weather shift. Her thumb found the inside ridge of the bracelet and rubbed it as she always did when measured thoughts began to assemble in her chest. The gesture was private, ancestral, Estelle's ritual of touch, a way of steadying the day. If this kind of quiet, high-stakes comeback interests you, if you like watching a slow, surgical reversal of power, subscribe and stay with this story. That night did not begin in the ballroom. It began in a kitchen with a chipped blue teacup and a window that watched a back lane of small trees. Estelle had been thin as a belief. She kept her life in tight, eloquent holdings, a ledger, a bracelet, a habit of naming things so they could be owned. When Muna was 20, Estelle pressed a cream envelope into her hands. Inside was a small stack of papers, trust documents and a checkbook that would not, by itself, amount to much. Estelle's voice had papered over whatever of the world was loudest. "Buy one thing," Estelle told her. "Put your name on it, so you know how to hold a thing that's yours." Muna had folded that order into the shape of her life. She had studied engineering and finance because she liked the honesty of equations and contracts. She enjoyed building things people could mistake for machines, but that were really social ecosystems, platforms that connected, matched, amplified. She met Chinua in an incubator's overlit room where earnest ambition smelled like coffee and plaster. He was charming and loud, she, quiet and precise. Together they made a company that, in the telling, seemed to emerge overnight. In private, it grew on the slow work of Muna's hands: product architectures, investor memos drafted with human friction in mind, competitor analyses with margins mapped so cleanly they read like harm reduction. She kept a notebook. The notebook was a witness filled with early designs, email drafts, promises Chinua whispered into late nights, and the ways he turned charm into currency. It also held the earliest calculations of ownership, the spreadsheets, the names, the concessions. When they incorporated, she accepted a title that read like modesty: head of product. Chinua took the headlines. She took the work. Estelle had smiled when she learned Muna's plan. "You are building the wrong way," she said once, and then smiled at Muna's frown. "Build the right way, and you will be surprised how sincere the world can be. Use the mathematics of money if you must. But remember, no one can take what your name owns." Muna began quietly, to make her name mean more than a role. She invested the small trust into an acquiring vehicle. She used legal structures, trusts guided by reputable counsel, a private holding company, shareholder agreements that bound votes. She was methodical. She bought into a second platform decade earlier, an early rival whose patents would later matter, and, over time, consolidated that stake into a controlling interest. She negotiated quietly, sometimes in rooms where no one ever wrote press releases. She used escrow, indemnities, voting proxies, and legal language that read like a second language of safety. It was not dramatic. It was accumulation. It was patience. When protests about credit arose, when early investors asked why Muna did not take the podium more often, or why her name did not appear on philanthropic op-eds, Chinua smiled wider. He told stories about the two of them, how she had taught him to think, how their partnership was the company's soul. The public loved myth. It gave them a neat romance and a face for spreadsheets. Privately, filings were amended. Her name receded in some public registers, removed at the insistence of operational privacy, by people who preferred the simpler tale of a charismatic founder than the messy reality of a partnership. She kept copies. She kept paper. The archive in her apartment, folders, prints of shareholder ledgers, notarized trust documents, was not the sort of thing friends admired. It was the sort of thing a lawyer insisted on and a judge later appreciated. The documents had been the white noise of her life. They were, in another story, the blueprint of a quiet empire. Betrayal arrived like late snow, slowly, then all at once. There were the second phones, devices with clean faces and private usernames. There were dinners where Chinua's laughter changed timbre, where Gloria invited home new names and affectionated them into the family lexicon. There was a day when Brenda and Terrence lingered too long over a family ledger. Once, awake in the small hours, Muna found an amended set of incorporation papers on the dining table, papers with her name absent, replaced by family designy language, and the signature of an attorney she did not recognize. She took a photograph with a hand that did not tremble. She left the paper where it lay, smiled when asked what was wrong, and washed a single cup in the sink. The removal of the board seat was different from those other erosions. It carried a theater he could sell. To Chinua, the board seat was not only a governance privilege, it was the visible hint of legitimacy he needed to preserve his narrative. To Renee, it was an ascension. To Gloria, it was finality. For Muna, at the table that night, the movement of the placard was an insult but not the only one. The act implied erasure. The gesture announced to everyone present that her consent no longer mattered publicly. She wore a burgundy dress that evening. It was a quiet thing, fabric that folded in soft pleats, sleeves that ended at the wrist so the bracelet could be seen. The bracelet was thin, its gold softened with use. It had belonged to Estelle. It had, in some decisive way, been a talisman for Muna's patience. She had been preparing for this kind of performance long before the banquet. The work she had done in the shadows, buying and consolidating, setting up a shareholder registry that counted, designing a chain of title that was unambiguous to courts and custodians, was not theatrical. It was legal labor, damp with receipts and signatures and the small cruelty of precise language. Warren had been the first person outside of Estelle she trusted, an attorney whose calm voice sounded like a lever being pulled. He was older than Muna by a decade and had the kind of face that made people lend him their attention. They met in rooms that smelled of new leather and coffee that had not been reheated twice. Warren read documents like a reader deciphers subtext. When Muna described her plan, consolidate ownership into a private holding, ensure beneficial interest was recorded with an independent custodian, secure voting agreements with the right to call extraordinary board meetings, Warren only nodded. "It will work if we bind everything in a line that cannot be broken by a careless signature," he said. "We will need clean chains of custody, notarizations that are airtight. We'll need to make sure the shareholders' register at the custodian reflects the transfers as of the date we choose to disclose." "Make it indelible," Muna replied. The word felt like a promise and a demand. They did not move quickly. That had been the point. Over months and then years, Muna acquired controlling shares through private transactions that were lawful, and as far as the law would ever be, ordinary for someone with the right accounts and patience. She purchased equity from long-term holders who wanted liquidity. She used convertible instruments at moments where public valuations were depressed. She accepted minority board seats on subsidiary entities and consolidated governance documents. She made offers in the dark of markets, when sellers did not look up, when valuations trembled and even principled owners would take cash. The math was stubborn. By the spring of a particular year, after a decade of accumulation, the holdings came into focus. A controlling interest in a private technology firm whose implied enterprise value hovered at $50 billion. Not a publicly traded ticker, not an IPO spectacle that could inflate or deflate on rumor. This was private capital, institutional trusts, and a registry that could be presented with signatures and notations. A $50 billion figure does not behave like gossip. It behaves like a legal fact once the papers are assembled to prove it. Muna never flaunted the number. She didn't need to. Numbers on internal memos were incidental. The central fact was control, an ability to call votes, to appoint board members, to influence contracts. She had built a legal and economic foundation that would hold under scrutiny. The slow inversion of power required allies. Warren became one. There were escrow banks with reputations to lose and custodians who would accept a transfer only if every I bore its dot. There were outside counsels whose retainer fees were high and whose discretion was higher. Clifton was an industry figure who kept his opinions measured. He had a reputation for calling things by their actual names, and a mere mention of his willingness to speak would move other voices to silence. Muna considered each of them in the way a gardener chooses tools, by how they fit in her hand, by the clean weight of their utility. She asked for what she needed and refused to be rushed. There were nights when she signed documents under a lamplight while a radio reported economic scoops. Days when she flew to meet an investor who insisted payment could only be made in the kind of trust she understood. There were lawyers who asked impertinent questions in order to forestall a better one. She enjoyed that kind of work, the thinking inside legal forms. The family noticed less than she expected. People who live in theatrical houses do not always detect the quiet movements that rearrange foundations. When Muna's name was erased from certain public-facing filings, it complicated nothing about the mechanism she had built. The people who mattered, the custodians, the registered shareholders, the escrow agents, had every document they required. The absence of her name on an optional web page meant nothing. Her beneficial ownership was recorded where it could not be casually edited. There were moments of aggression. Once, at the kitchen table, Chinua and Gloria presented her with forms. The forms asked her to agree to operational delegation and to sign a clause promising to relinquish day-to-day governance for the sake of family stability. They used the language of peace. They were adept at making surrender sound like empathy. Muna asked for time. She sat with the forms and let Chinua speak. She drank a glass of water. She signed nothing. She proposed a counter-meeting. Her calm had the quality of a lake in which whales had been sleeping. She began to prepare in a different register, an architecture not of surrender but of revelation. Warren, with his quiet voice, began drafting a sequence of legal moves that would make control indisputable. Properly executed transfers to a holding company, recorded beneficial ownership with an independent trustee, the lodgment of verified shareholder registry copies with counsel. They would have formal letters to custodians accepting the change of beneficial interest. They would draft a press release that stated facts without contempt. Make it so that people cannot say you cheated them, Warren advised once. Make it so the story is simple. He liked simplicity. Muna liked it too. There were other practicalities. If control was to matter, it had to be announced in a way that coincided with a moment when the industry would pay attention. An industry banquet offered choreography, cameras, the presence of journalists, the magnified hush of applause. Chinua would buy narratives with a smile. Muna's timing had to undercut that. She planned to be present at the banquet to witness the theater of her removal. That night would be the last time she would accept performance as fact. She would not explode. She would not hawk the truth from a corner table. She would move with the inevitability of an accounting ledger that closes. Her preparation was not only legal, it was aesthetic. She made a choice about clothes because clothes are currency in a room where optics are everything. The burgundy dress was not a challenge, it was a refusal to be invisible. She chose the cream envelope and placed it in her bag because she liked the way small things looked when they were poised to matter. She put the bracelet on because it helped her remember Estelle's kitchen and the private promise she had made to herself 10 years earlier. On the morning of the banquet, she met with Warren one last time. They were in a narrow office with a view of the river that looked like oil glass. Warren slid a leather folder across the table. Inside, documents were stacked like compact metaphors, each page precise signatures, notarizations, countersigned agreements. He did not offer to explain every clause. He did not need to. When the transfer's clear, he said, the shareholder register will show the holding company as having controlling interest. The custodian will confirm the change in beneficial ownership as of the timestamp on these files. Muna held the folder as if it were a physical thing that could persuade. And Clifton? Clifton will be where we asked, Warren said. He will not speak in hyperbole. He will simply say what the registry says. People respect that. People listen. The cameras will pivot. The market will respond. Her thumb traced the edge of a contract. There was a small decisive satisfaction in knowing authority had been built on paper and practice rather than rhetoric. At the banquet, the orchestra still played a string arrangement and waiters moved between tables like cargo. Muna watched Chinua's spectacle with a steady gaze. Down the table, Renee laughed in a way that invited microphones. Gloria's claps were louder now, a kind of applause that wanted to finalize. Phones began to vibrate with the minor tremors of messages, friends, reporters, photos from guests. The chandelier light carved the faces of the room into memorable angles. Cameras lingered on Renee's gold gown. Chinua's grin was the kind that bakes its own mythology. Muna's team had prepared counsel at 3 different registrars, escrow institutions primed to confirm. Warren's assistant had flown to the relevant custodian and waited. Her signature had been collected in the manner required, witnessed, notarized, and then routed through the proper chain. There had been a moment that afternoon when 2 people in a downtown office watched as an electronic verification came back green. Those who handled the infrastructure saw what mattered and moved their machines to do precise labor. No one in the room knew it yet. That was the point. As Renee took her seat at the head row, Muna's phone hummed once, a quiet, secure ping. Warren's message read only, complete. A single word. It carried an institutional weight. She touched the bracelet again. The gold was warm with the heat of her skin. For a second, the noise of the room felt distant, like the faint rush of a distant tide. Her mouth shaped a line of gratitude that was private. To Estelle, to the small ledger, to the years of patient purchases that had been nothing to boast of but everything in accumulation. Chinua continued his speech. People laughed at his easy jokes. He spoke of growth and of making room. When he pronounced the transfer of her seat public, an act that was meant to erase her overnight, Muna's expression did not move. The microphone had been tapped twice. The sound still echoed in her bones. There was an interval, a human fraction, where the applause swelled and rolled back. Reporters tilted their heads in the soft light. Cameras kept their lenses as if waiting for the next beat. In the kitchen of her past, Estelle would have called this patience. In the quiet of a lawyer's office, Warren would have called it a closing. In a banquet lit by chandeliers and cameras, it read like a pause that might hold consequences. Someone raised a glass. Chinua nodded to Renee. The moment was supposed to be a coronation. It was, for everyone else, a clean story with a face you could print in a Sunday magazine. For Muna, it was a hinge. Her phone buzzed again, and then a second later the soft chime of Warren's computer registered into the room like a small bell. A terse notification. Custodian confirmed. Beneficial interest recorded. Timestamp 8:27 p.m. There are things that sound like announcements and things that are announcements. This was the latter. The legal architecture they had built, trust documents, shareholder registry, voting agreements, had closed in accordance with the plan. It was not an act of theatrical revenge, it was a correction of record. It was a revelation of fact meant to unmake a performative wrong. Muna folded the cream envelope into the small, deliberate rectangle it had become. She did not unfold it. She kept the evidence folded, the way a person keeps a passport on a day the world is going to change. Chinua's voice kept filling the room. He cut a hand toward Renee as if gift-giving were still possible. No one saw Warren's assistant slip a quiet message into a group chat. Clifton en route. A man in a neutral coat stood near the bar, an extra who did not belong to the performance but who belonged to the reality of networks. Muna rose slowly enough that the movement read like attention rather than reaction. She walked to where the servers had placed a step for performers to address guests. The light drew her face into a focused, spare portrait, the careful geometry of someone who had been practicing for a different stage. She did not reach for the microphone immediately. The room exhaled. The cameras recalibrated. The moment held, as all such moments do, between expectation and a sound that changes everything. Her hand closed around the cream envelope. The leather of her shoe made a soft sound against the stage wood. She looked at Chinua once, with the exact softness of someone whose quiet had been misread for weakness. She did not hiss or spit. She offered the world a line not meant to wound but to correct. At her elbow, Warren's face was unreadable. The man at the bar in the neutral coat touched his phone and then tucked his thumb away. Outside the glass doors, a city breathed, unaware of the pivot about to be measured in signatures and registries. Muna's voice, when she finally spoke, did not rise high. It merely rose clear, and the room listened because people listened to clarity. She quoted someone who had lived with her entire life, Estelle, and the words slid into the hall like light.
"Buy one thing," she said, and there was a silence that felt like a ledger closing. Her eyes found Chinua's. For a moment the public and the private cross-threaded. The cameras obligingly captured the glance. Then, before anyone could file the moment away in a neat headline, the hum of phones in the room deepened, an invisible footnote moving through networks.
There were 3 ways to witness a shift like this: as theater, as theft, or as the correction of a public record. The cameras and the applause had prepared the room for the first reading. The legal facts Warren had ferried to 3 separate custodians, and then to a trusted industry voice prepared the other 2. Some people in the hall began to look at their phones. Others held still, trying to understand whether they had missed part of the story. Reporters shifted, a little, toward the periphery. The man at the bar, the one who was not part of the banquet's cast, moved through the crowd as someone who carries a rumor but intends to deliver it as fact. Muna opened the cream envelope then, but not to produce a dramatic paper that could be waved like a talisman. Inside was a single folded sheet. A formal notice Warren had instructed and registered. A clean statement that the holding company controlled the firm's majority shares and that the custodian had lodged the transfer. It was precise, dull to the eye, and devastating in function. She let the paper rest on the podium. She folded her fingers over it so the room could see nothing but the intention behind them. The sound of her heartbeat, if it existed audibly to anyone, was the sound of a long, catalogued patience. Chinua's smile began to look a little small. At the table where Gloria sat, there was a narrowing of the eyes that read like a calculation. At the press desks, fingers moved faster. Someone murmured a question about stock value, an odd phrase because the company was private, but the language of markets had leaked into the air anyway. There was the first ripple of recalculation, the small physical act of people imagining consequences beyond tonight's applause. Muna did not raise her voice to explain. She did not need to. The papers included the timestamps, the custodian confirmations, the notarized signatures. They were not theatrical. They were legal facts that could be read aloud if anyone wished. Warren's assistant moved through the crowd like a quiet tide and made a call. "Clifton is on the floor," he said into his sleeve. "He will make the affirmation now." The man at the bar, a man whose job was to validate what indolent crowds often wish to ignore, stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not perform. He read the registry with a voice like someone reading a historical record, and his words made the room do what good facts do. They forced people to update their maps. "To be clear," he said, "the registry confirms that controlling interest is held by the Muna Holding Limited. The custodian has verified beneficial ownership as of 8:27 p.m. The room did not know how to be polite with the suddenness of law. There were immediate practicalities. Fund managers at the next table shifted, calculating counterparty risk as if they could smell it. Journalists scribbled. Phones were raised in the air like new hands trying to be the first to capture what would, if the truth held, break the neat story that Chinua had been polishing for years. He looked at Muna then in a way that was stripped of charm. Charm is a form of armor. Legal fact is a form of corrosion. She held the photograph of the ledger in her head, the small kitchen, Estelle's hand, the blue teacup. She had done what she was taught. She had bought something and put her name on it. The rest had been management. For a moment there was only the smell of perfume and the cool of chandeliers. The banquet's music became an awkward soundtrack for something else. The sound of a story rereading itself. Muna stepped back because she had more to do than to witness the collapse of a myth. She adjusted the bracelet, felt its warm ring, and turned away from the stage. She moved through applause that felt less like admiration and more like a search for the right narrative to rest upon. Chinua sat for a second as if the world had become heavier than before. Renee's mouth made a small O that was neither anger nor surprise but a private form of confusion. Outside, the night air was cool and tasted like rain. Inside, conversations began to spin in different directions. Contracts, reputational exposures, who would call whom in the morning. The architecture of a $50 billion private firm did not crumble because a social mic had been tapped differently. It recalibrated. Investors reminded themselves what a registry meant. Lawyers calculated their emails. Families recalculated loyalties. Muna walked to the coat check and collected her bag. She did not rush. She did not smile theatrically for any camera. A single reporter peeled away from a table and asked, "Ms. Muna, will you comment on the registry confirmation?" She looked at the reporter kindly. "Everything in the registry is what it is," she said. Her voice was not triumphant. It was matter-of-fact. "I prefer to let the documents speak. There were consequences," whispers began, and they would arrive not as a single blow but as a sequence. Calls from major clients, audits, the quiet refusal of banks and partners who did not like ambiguity. Chinua might lose leverage. Contracts could be reviewed. Auditors might find irregularities in the company's accounts, or they might not. The law would move with its own slowness and precision. Reputation would, mercifully and cruelly, move faster. She walked into the night with the small sound of heels and the soft chime of a phone that would, in the coming hours, populate with messages that demanded navigation. Her reflection in a car window was a woman with a bracelet that had outlived a plan. The cream envelope was still folded in her bag, useless now because the facts were public in the only way that counts, verified. She thought briefly of Estelle's kitchen and the blue teacup and the way a small instruction can become strategy. She thought of the notebooks and the early meetings, of the way she had taught herself to wait until the proper form of truth could be presented. There was one more signature to confirm, a corporate housekeeping thing, a mundane step Warren had insisted on. And then the custodian would file a public confirmation for the limited partners and the larger institutions in the morning. But that had been arranged. It was simply the last damp edge of an otherwise dry fact. Behind her in the deserted corridor outside the ballroom, her phone buzzed persistently. The future arrived as a set of small tasks. The larger dramas would begin in the morning when the world converts legal facts into newsprint and contracts into consequences. Muna walked to the taxi line. The rain began to fall in a hush that made the city smell like iron. She put the bracelet back beneath her sleeve for a moment, the way one tucks an ancestral map into a pocket. She would return to the folders, the notarized documents, the ledger that had been her quiet centurion. She would, by dawn, be ready for the calls that would certainly come from lawyers, clients, and board members who suddenly remembered the value of prudence. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the bracing calm of work made accurate. The hand that had once written product specs now held the shape of a different paper. The proof that a person had chosen to be the owner of her life and had, with patience and legal good faith, made that choice visible at the right time. A taxi door closed. The city blurred into streaks of light. The sound of the banquet receded. At the back of the taxi, as the car pulled away, her phone gave a small, final chime. A forwarded message from Warren, one word and a timestamp. The city unrolled before her like a ledger awaiting the morning's corrections. The taxi moved through wet streets like a thought retreating into the dark. Muna watched the reflections slice and rejoin, the city reconstructing itself in bands of light. She had a list in her head, small immediate chores and larger patient logistics that would take weeks to unspool. Calls to counsel. A careful message to the board of the firm she now controlled by deed and registry. An instruction to Warren. Begin a rolling disclosure to institutional partners at dawn. Nothing impulsive. Everything precise. By the time she reached her apartment, the city had adopted the hush of a place that knows it will be woken soon. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon and wool. In the hallway, the portrait of Estelle looked like the pausing of a sentence. Muna paused in front of it anyway, thumb finding the inside ridge of the bracelet as she always did. Familiarity steadied her like a keel. She dropped her bag on a small table and let the phone live until the morning. She would answer what required immediate attention, but she would not be baited by spectacle. She slept in 2-hour increments, fitful and efficient. When the first gray light arrived, her phone lit with names and terse subject lines. Confirming receipt. Call me. Urgent. Press. A small constellation of practitioners, custodians, escrow officers, the independent trustee, had already begun the work Warren had scheduled. In an industry that loved to measure everything against market whims, the morning would be measured differently, by documents opened, by emails scanned, by counsel's stamps. Warren came early to her flat, with black coffee, and a gentleness that had nothing to do with sentiment. He carried a briefcase of paper, though much of the work now lived in secure servers and timestamps. They sat at the kitchen table, Muna's hands around a mug, the blue teacup like a memory of calibration. Good, he said simply. The custodian sent a confirmation to the limited partners. Copies went to the institutional counsel lists we compiled. Clifton prepared his statement. We kept the language calm, no chest thumping, facts only. Facts are stubborn, Muna said, and the phrase was not a boast but a recognition. Warren nodded. There will be pushback. There will be questions. But the institution is hard to contest when the paper is right. They began the smaller tasks in order. Warren instructed her to authorize a terse, factual press briefing. No melodrama, only the confirmation of factual transfer and the custodian's notice for limited partners. He drafted a schedule for controlled interviews, select outlets, controlled disclosures, and a short call with a small number of key clients whose contracts were sensitive to counterparty risk. Be ready for the call from Astratech, Warren said. Their counsel will ask for immediate assurances about contract continuity. Be prepared to say you will personally oversee any transition to minimize disruption. Keep it operational. Muna read the draft and crossed nothing out. The words were spare because they needed to be unassailable. She authorized the release and signed off on the distribution list. There was no gloating in the language, only the quiet correctness of confirmation. It was a voice she recognized as useful. Within the hour, newsrooms had picked up the banquet footage and paired it with Clifton's measured comment. Most pieces grounded themselves in spectacle at first, an elevated narrative of betrayal and drama. But the next tier of coverage shifted like iron to fact. Analysts and legal commentators began to ask questions that the documents answered. Institutional newsletters forwarded the custodian's confirmation to subscribers. Private investors who had not slept well the night before began to call their fiduciaries. Muna spent the morning in conference calls that were a sequence of calibrations. She listened more than she spoke. Clients sought reassurance, partners recalculated exposures, counsel requested minute-by-minute documentation that would be needed if any counterparty tried to claim procedural irregularities. Her answers were practical. She arranged a small working group to manage continuity. She accepted that some partners would pause, not because they believed in allegations, but because markets, public or private, preferred to see tidy certainties before they committed capital. Chinua's morning, by contrast, was a different choreography. He woke to a feed of messages that had the particular sting of being caught mid-creation. Images from the banquet proliferated. Renee in gold. Chinua's performative tenderness. The moment with the placard. Then, layered over the images were transcriptions. Clifton's statement. The custodian's confirmation, the terse corporate filing that bore Muna Holding Limited's name as controlling interest. He read them in the order they arrived and then read them again. The second reading had less performance in it and more the feel of ledger, the thing itself now recorded. He called Gloria. Their conversation was a flurry of admonitions and pleas that were not pleas so much as demands for narrative control. "It is just paperwork," he said into the phone more than once, as if repetition could render fact negotiable. "The board will see. People will understand." But the board could not make themselves into a registry. In corporate governance there were two realities: what cameras could frame and what recorded legal interest established. The latter was stubborn in its own way. Investors were pragmatic. Some would stand and wait. Others, especially those with lines to public financing or to risk committees, began to ask their counsel to review contractual covenants tied to key executives and to critical counterparties. At Chinua's firm, the first dominoes were small and public-facing. A marketing partner asked to suspend a co-branded campaign until their contracts reassured continuity. A sponsor of a marquee product demo postponed. The lawyers recommended an emergency board meeting to discuss reputational damage control, timed, worded, and performed in ways that hoped to reassert narrative. The emergency meeting, when it took place, revealed fractures the banquet had only hinted at. A few directors who had been comfortable with Chinua's persona were surprised at the temperature of the room. Others, who had long suspected governance looseness, quietly asked questions about signatures, conflict disclosures, and any sign of self-dealing that would distract clients from product roadmaps. No one yet alleged criminality, but the board had to act to preserve confidence. Back in her apartment, Muna watched the meetings become public knowledge through the press and the levers of her carefully chosen monitors. She allowed herself to feel melancholy for a moment, not for riches, but for the way partnership had been misrepresented. Then she folded that feeling into a to-do list and called Clifton. Clifton answered on the second ring. In person, he had been steady. On the phone, he was steadier. "You did well," he said without florid praise. "There was no need for it. You moved slowly. You moved right." "I did what Estelle told me to do," Muna replied. "I bought one thing." They spoke about the first wave, how the custodian would proceed, which limited partners would require direct notice, and how best to position Muna as a stabilizing hand rather than an avenger. Clifton's influence was useful precisely because he kept distance from spectacle. He agreed to appear at a small industry roundtable later in the week, nothing televised, no cameras, where he would calmly affirm the registry and speak to continuity. "People will call you," he said. "Answer the right ones and divert the rest. Keep it to operations." "I will," she said. "I have a team." Her team that week became a succession of focused meetings: talent retention for executives who feared instability, counsel dealing with potential civil suits alleging breaches of trust, and outreach to long-standing clients whose contracts contained clauses triggered by management disputes. She would not hide from the practicalities. She would embrace them. Control, she had learned, was a sequence of small assured acts, not an attitude. Renee's reaction was slower and more human in its confusion. She had arrived at the banquet thinking she was stepping into a role that would change her standing. She had felt the lights, the cameras, the soft lift of tradition, the sort of social capital that could be taught like a posture. When the registry news reached her, the immediate thing she felt was vertigo. The social scaffolding had been replaced by a set of legal facts. For someone accustomed to applause, the precision of statutes and custodian confirmations felt like the wrong category of truth. Renee withdrew, first from the public stage and then from other markers of visibility. She sent messages to Gloria that asked for counsel, then withdrew them. Gloria, who had been practiced in the theater of family displays, found herself in an intimate panic that had not been scripted. Her applause had been a form of sealing. It had made a public contract in the eyes of many. What she had not accounted for was that contracts could be witnessed elsewhere, and that witnesses could overrule applause. Terrence and Brenda performed a different sort of calculus. They called friends and associates and attempted to triangulate their own positions. How much had they known? How implicated were they? Would partnership ties be a shield or a liability. For family members who had opted to align with Chinua's public persona, the morning's revelations presented a new ledger. Reputational risk. They were not innocent. They were simply surprised at how quickly a ledger could change weight.
In the days that followed, the sequences of consequence multiplied but remained procedural rather than lurid. Several major clients requested meetings to confirm contractual obligations and to renegotiate terms that had been written with a different set of assumptions. One partner, an institution with significant procurement commitments, asked for a full review of vendor agreements. The review landed on the desk of a legal team whose central concern was continuity of service.
They proposed incremental amendments and required performance guarantees. Muna agreed to supply them, personally ensuring that the teams who had lived inside product lines maintained continuity. There was a company audit requested by a consortium of partners who had always treated governance questions as a matter of prudence. Investigators arrived not with sirens, but with spreadsheets and lists of email chains. Their work was mechanical and exhausting. They wanted signatures, timestamps, delivery confirmations. This was the kind of labor Muna knew the truth of. An economy of facts that overlooked grandstanding. Meanwhile, whispers hardened into legal filings. A shareholder petitioner, prompted by unease and by the opportune counsel of opportunists, filed to see certain internal memos and to review how public-facing filings had been amended over the years. It was procedural, as such suits often are, and it would be litigated into motions and counter-motions. Warren and Muna prepared for depositions and document produces, for the choreographic dance of discovery. She found something mildly consoling in the mundane formality of it all. The law made people talk to paper. Chinua's status unmoored in increments. Board committees asked for meetings. The head of compliance cited growing reputational concern and suggested the step of a temporary leave while an audit was conducted. Some directors, worried about liabilities and reputational exposure, quietly pushed back on his leadership. Others, loyal and frightened, defended him. The director conversations were not melodramatic. They were careful, tactical, and sometimes cruel in their arithmetic. Muna did not gloat at the unraveling. She took calls that assuaged anxieties and those that required repair. She looked at contracts that named Chinua in operational roles and planned personnel changes that would protect product continuity and talent retention. She knew replacing a public face had consequences. Talent leaves, clients startled. But she also knew that some departures would be unavoidable because relationships had been predicated on a narrative that had proven unstable. The press leaned into a human drama they loved, the fall of a charismatic founder. Profiles paired banquet photos with archival images of the early days. Commentators debated the ethics of power and partnership, what it meant to wield visibility, and what it meant to control the levers behind the curtain. Some took the mischievous path and suggested that the banquet had been a spectacular miscalculation. Others marveled at the legal machinery that had been patiently assembled. The coverage had the double effect of consolidating Muna's public image as the owner with a calm hand, and drawing attention to Chinua's misreports of public role. Investors, whose job it is to reduce uncertainty, began to pull non-essential funding and to ask more exacting questions of counsel. Opportunities dried up not because companies wanted to punish any individual, but because institutions required tidy governance to accept binding long-term exposure. The market for connections preferred low friction. That morning's registrar confirmation had introduced friction. Renee became, in time, a lesser figure in the coverage. She retreated, then disappeared from social calendars and from the glossy lists that had once hosted her. People remarked on the speed of comebacks and the manners of endings. For some, the disappearance was a moral tidy-up. For others, it was an unseemly cleaning of a breakfast table. In quieter corners, family dynamics rebalanced. Gloria's shock gave way to a deeper reckoning. Old choices, old alliances, and an embarrassment that hovered at her like humidity. She called Muna once, then twice. The calls were awkward and held more apology in their silence than in their words. Muna returned the calls when it felt necessary for the business. Family had a way of intersecting with the firm's public matters. She offered protocols rather than absolution. If Gloria wanted to find a way back into civility, there were rituals to perform, a willingness to speak with certain lawyers, a readiness to appear as a cooperating witness in certain interviews. These were not punishments, but practicalities. Throughout, Estelle's memory remained a lodestone. Muna found herself thinking of the small rule, buy one thing, and how it had been less a financial instruction than a habit of ownership. She began to convert that private lesson into a public instrument. She created quietly at first a small foundation in Estelle's name, seeded with a portion of the firm's philanthropic discretion. It would focus on capacity building for women in technical fields, the sort of slow, structural change Estelle would have liked. The foundation's formation was not a PR move, it was a corrective one. It was Muna's way of turning a personal strategy into a public instrument. Warren remained at her elbow as legal storms brewed. He ran the discovery calendar with a surgeon's steadiness. Expect 3 months, he told her once, folding a schedule into a neat rectangle. Legal inertia will move at its pace. The media will move faster. You will need both patience and quick tact. She accepted the calendar. She also began the physical work of creating distance from old rooms and narratives. She bought a plot of land outside the city, a parcel of red clay, where old maps had recorded little but fields and sky. It was not an escape. It was, rather, a place with the rare integrity of absence, a place where she could make, in public and private, a new frame for life. The purchase was quiet, executed by counsel with the same precision that had defined the registry transfers. She walked the land once in late summer, the soil warm and thick under her boots, and thought about foundations. Building would be an act in both senses, the literal raising of beams and the figurative reassembly of a life, without the burden of someone else's narrative. The first hammer fell on a Monday morning. She stood at the edge of the clearing and watched a crew she had hired, local builders with lean hands and practical talk, unwrap slabs of timber. The sound of hammers hitting nail heads was not triumphal. It was the sound of industry and craft and small, steady progress. There was no need for applause. The measure of a home, she thought, was not how much light it let in, but how much it held. From distance, Brandon, the site foreman, took his directions from a plan Muna reviewed with a kind of gentle insistence. She had taught product teams for years. Now she taught builders that walls should be placed with intention, that windows should always look toward the way the sun climbs. There was a particular logic she applied to the house. Rooms that were public enough to host conversation but private enough to hold study. A kitchen big enough for blue teacups to live on the windowsill. The house rose slowly. The porch frame came up with a certain simplicity, straight lines, a quiet welcome. When the foundation was poured, Muna stood nearby and watched the concrete swallow the rebar, thinking about the other foundations she had poured in corporate rooms, agreements, trusts, custodians. They were different materials but shared a fidelity to precise measurements. Chinua watched the evolution of events from a different architectural perspective. His board had initiated an internal review. Senior partners were in negotiations concerning his remaining executive roles. He found himself measured by other people's assessment of risk and prudence. Opportunities diminished, not because networks had chosen to punish him, but because prudent institutions preferred a different profile for long-term engagement. That said, there were those who remained loyal to him in the way some were loyal to stories rather than to facts. He counseled with those allies, bristled at their doubt, and found in himself a fierce desire to reclaim the narrative with charm. At a public hearing convened by a consortium of partners, Chinua appeared with counsels who argued that he had been a visible founder, whose value lay in charisma and public affiliation. The hearing had the discreet tone of corporate life's minor trials, statements, affidavits, and polite, relentless questioning about governance. He answered with charm where possible, and with thinly veiled indignation elsewhere. The net effect was not dramatic exoneration. It was an administrative pruning. Contracts were re-examined. Certain discretionary authorities were withdrawn. Chinua would not be forced into ruin by the law, but he would be deprived of the particular levers that had made spectacle work for him. The company Muna now controlled did not, by virtue of registry, become a theater of revenge. Instead, It shifted into governance. She moved to appoint a pragmatic slate of directors, technologists and operators whose names were quiet in press rooms but respected in boardrooms. Clifton accepted a place as an independent observer, a guardian who would call out excess quietly. Her aim was stabilization, not domination. Some critics framed her choices as antiseptic, as if the absence of public vengeance were a moral failing. Muna, however, was uninterested in the theater of performance. She wanted sustainability. She wanted product roadmaps fulfilled. She wanted the people who built the technology to have confidence that their work would continue to matter. In her view, restitution was not the same as spectacle. Legal disputes grounded themselves in procedural mechanics. A minority shareholder motion, driven by a broker who smelled opportunity in dislocation, filed claims alleging lack of disclosure in a past set of filings. The motion had teeth in the form of discovery obligations, but in substance it asked questions that Muna's archive answered. Her counsel walked each line of request with the patience of a cartographer. They provided documents, verified timestamps, and offered depositions. It was, in law, the slow unspooling of clarity. The process was expensive and wearing, but the legal architecture Muna had built meant that the petitions rarely landed with the catastrophic force their sponsors had hoped. Meanwhile, philanthropic partners and technical collaborators reached out. Some were tentative, others were eager. A university lab, proud of early work with the firm, proposed a partnership that would fund scholarships for women in engineering, an idea that matched Estelle's quiet mission and built toward future ecosystems rather than grudges. Muna accepted. The foundation in Estelle's name took its first steps: grant proposals, scholarship interviews, and a small symposium that convened thinkers who had been excluded from the boards where decisions were made. It was small, but true. At home on the red clay lot, the porch took on a life of its own. Muna came down at dawn on weekends, sometimes with Warren beside her, sometimes alone. There, with the building humming and the weather never entirely predictable, she learned to appreciate the banality of progress, the way a roofline can be measured and remade until it fits better with the horizon. The press, which had loved dramatic arcs, slowly turned to other stories. Corporate news moved like tide. One day the banquet footage was front page. The next week there were earnings reports to parse and product launches to preview. But the narrative that had once delighted in spectacle had been altered. Where Chinua had once been the principal face, reporters now approached Muna for comments about continuity and stewardship. She answered in the same manner she answered counsel, precisely and with a refusal of flourish. At a small, carefully chosen industry symposium months later, Clifton introduced her not as a vindicated spouse but as a steward. He did not mock her former partner. He did not indulge in gossip. His voice was steady. His introduction was not about the banquet, but about the work. Cameras were present, but the event was chosen to be the kind of place where substance mattered more than splash. She accepted the stage with the same calm as before. She spoke about product, about responsibility, and about the ante that good governance required. She mentioned Estelle not as a dramatic touch, but as the origin of a policy. That ownership needed to be legible, and that ownership confers obligations as well as rights. The way the industry responded was, in many parts, a study in pragmatism. Some contracts that had been paused were renegotiated. Some partners preferred a new slate of signatories, a reconstitution of certain relationships. The signal that mattered most was not applause but continuity. Clients who had feared abrupt transitions were mollified by operational assurances and the appointment of directors who had demonstrable records of delivery. That, more than any headline, restored the confidence necessary for the firm's projects to continue. Chinua, meanwhile, found himself navigating a different orbit. He lost some privileges, the ability to sign for certain procurement decisions, the trust of certain clients, and the luxury of assuming loyalty would suffice. He attempted to reclaim a place by seeking to reframe his contributions as visionary, while conceding practical governance to others. It was, in a way, a recalibration. His public gifts still had value, but they would now exist within structures that prioritized the organization's continuity above personal narrative. The family scene had months of quiet work. Gloria did a form of public contrition, Small practical gestures that were less about confession than about re-embedding herself into a life with less of the power she had once exercised. Brenda and Terrence made adjustments to their public profiles. The family learned, in the hard way many families do, that the architecture of favors and performance could not withstand the check of a registry. Renee, who had once been a personification of modern social aspiration, quietly relocated to a different city. It was not a dramatic exit. There were no scenes of scandal. She simply faded from the profiles she had once attended. For someone who had lived on applause, the absence of cameras was a radical new category of being. She took work that had nothing to do with circuits of celebrity. A few years later, she sent a note of thanks to Muna through a mutual acquaintance, an awkward but sincere message about how the experience had taught her something about the fragility of social ascent. Muna's house rose into the shape she had planned. The porch framed a view that moved from the road to a stand of trees, and in the evenings, she would sit with the bracelet on the inside ridge of her wrist and feel the small, warm weight of metal against skin. The sounds of the site, hammers, saws, the soft banter of workers, took on the tone of a hymn. They were not anthems of revenge, but of ordinary building. The final piece that felt like an answer to the banquet was not a public pronouncement, but a private registry move. Muna decided to open an internal governance fund to ensure that the firm she controlled would have a system of transparent succession and a small council of independent trustees who could arbitrate disputes. It was less a consolidation than a distribution of power designed to prevent the sorts of errors that had once allowed visibility to be mistaken for control. One evening, as the house neared completion, she invited a small group, the builders, Warren, Clifton, and 2 engineers who had been with the original product team, to stand on the porch as the sunsets laid gold across the clay. There was no ceremony. There was coffee and crisp tea and the thin, comfortable laughter of people who had done hard work and understood the cost of continuity. "You taught the room a lesson," Clifton said quietly, which was to say more than applause. "You built a governance that matched the scale of what you wanted to protect." "It was less about teaching a lesson and more about doing the work," she replied. "We spend so much time explaining to people what control looks like. I wanted them to see it as a practice." They watched the workers nail the final boards into place. For a long moment, no one spoke, and the sound was simply the completion of tasks. The house had a modest porch, broad windows that caught late sun, and a kitchen with a shelf carved for blue teacups. A month later, the last of the legal motions quieted into a manageable cadence. Some suits were settled with narrow terms and without admission of wrongdoing, standard corporate resolutions to avoid the long, costly uncertainty of prolonged litigation. Other petitions were dismissed on procedural grounds. Public chatter moved on. The firm continued to function. Talent stayed because trust was rebuilt, not by spectacle, but by steady management. Muna did not become a celebrity. She became rather a person who had been understood properly within the structures that mattered to governance. People respected her, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes warmly. The work of the product teams continued. Engineers she had mentored were promoted. The projects that had once been tethered to a founder's persona now lived on in code and infrastructure and cross-functional teams. Once, when Warren and she walked the land in late autumn, the ground soft with rain, she thanked him privately. "You did not flinch," she said. He shrugged. "You made the plan. I signed for keeping it simple." She took his meaning. Planning was a moral act in her world. It was how one made obligations legible. It was how one prevented the spectacle of a banquet from becoming a legal shortfall. "Estelle would approve," she said, feeling the small laugh that came with gratitude. When the house was finished, Muna hosted a small gathering, friends, a few mentors, and some scholars from the fellowship her foundation supported. There was no press invitation. It was not a parade, but a communion of people who had been part of various slow labors. Someone asked for a tour of the kitchen and found the blue teacup sitting by the sink like an old friend. That evening, as candles threw soft light, she stood on the porch and watched the workers pack up. Their laughter broke the lit hush of the closing day. She touched the bracelet one last time and thought about how small rituals had the power to steer lives. She had been erased publicly and had, in methodical ways, reasserted ownership where ownership mattered most. Before they left, Clifton found her in the doorway. "People will tell this story in two ways," he said. "They will tell the banquet version and the registry version. The latter will be more useful to your successors." "That is the point," she replied. "I prefer things to be useful." He smiled, and Estelle would be pleased. They watched in silence as a band of hammerheads swung briefly, then stowed. Somewhere in the distance, a radio murmured an old song about mornings and labor. The line of houses down the road kept their anonymous lights. The city below held its persistent hum. Inside, a kettle clicked faintly in the kitchen. Muna closed the door behind her and leaned for a moment on the frame, feeling the subtle give of the house she had helped call into being. The world had laws that could be invoked, and people who behaved with theater, but in the end, she reflected, agency was the long, patient business of building. There were, of course, things she could not unmake. Years that had been appropriated by stories that had not told of her labor. The small betrayals that had left bruises on family memory. There were also things she had made anew. A foundation that carried her grandmother's name. A governance structure that insisted on legibility. A house with a porch where blue teacups could sit in the sun. As night settled, she placed the cream envelope in the top drawer of a small desk she would use for foundation letters, and kept the bracelet on her wrist. She had no desire to replay the banquet's theater. That moment had served its purpose. The world had learned to reconcile appearance with recorded fact. Her life had shifted from reacting to constructing. Before closing the door to the study, she paused and, in the small way that rituals keep the future from becoming slippery, sent a brief note to supporters of the foundation. It was not a manifesto, but a simple invocation. Work that endures will always require the patience of accumulation and the discipline of clear records. She turned the lamp off and the house eased into darkness, plastered against the field in silhouette. The sound of hammers had passed into memory, and what remained was steady. A home, an office with neat files, an obligation to young engineers to whom she owed not politics but opportunity. In the coming months, the channel that had first carried the banquet footage would release a measured piece about governance and the dangers of mistaking visibility for ownership. Viewers would watch and be intrigued by the twist. A woman sidelined at a table had, in fact, been the legal owner all along. They would marvel not only at the moment of reveal, but at the slow years of accumulation that had made reveal possible. If this story, of patient strategy, nonviolent redress, and the quiet labor of ownership, resonates with you, there are more like it. For those who want to explore similar stories of comebacks, governance, and the subtleties of corporate life, check the playlist linked at the end of this video. It gathers narratives where the most reliable power is not spectacle but the steady practice of building. Muna stood at her window one last time before sleep, the bracelet like a faint constellation on her wrist. The land beyond the porch held a few stars. She let the quiet be enough. The lights in town blinked on, indifferent and ordinary. Buildings do not always require drama to be remembered, they require care. She had enough of both.